At the start of 2024, the U.S. cattle herd shrank to its lowest level since the early 1950s. This is a historic low point, not seen in over 70 years, with all cattle and calves nationwide totaling about 87 million head, a level last recorded around 1951. For experienced cattle ranchers, especially in Texas, these numbers confirm what you've been living through. Years of herd liquidation driven by relentless drought and high costs had pushed the industry into uncharted territory. Texas, the nation's largest cattle state, has been hit particularly hard. The Texas beef cow herd dropped to roughly 4.1 million head, the smallest Texas herd since 2014. That decline erased gains made after the 2011-2012 drought and represents about a 12% drop since 2019 due to consecutive dry years. Given that Texas typically carries about 14 to 15% of the U.S. cattle herd, what happens in Texas has a big impact nationwide. In this video, we'll explain how we got here and why. We'll break down the accelerated herd liquidation process and the key operational drivers behind it, severe drought with a spotlight on Texas, elevated cow and heifer slaughter rates, skyrocketing feed costs and forage shortages, and persistent labor shortages. Then we'll discuss why rebuilding the herd will take time, thanks to cattle biology, breeding and reproduction timelines, ongoing drought risks, volatile feed markets, and workforce constraints.
Herd liquidation refers to the widespread reduction of cattle numbers as producers sell off or cull breeding stock faster than they replace them. Over the past few years, the U.S. beef industry has experienced an extended liquidation phase, meaning more cattle, especially cows and heifers, have been sent to market than retained for herd maintenance. In fact, the national herd has been contracting since it peaked at 94.7 million head in 2019. By January 2024, beef cow numbers fell to about 28.2 million head, the smallest beef cow herd the country has seen in roughly 63 years, the lowest since 1961 for beef cows. Ranchers have been marketing a higher than normal percentage of female cattle, both cows and replacement heifers, which is unusual except in tough times. This accelerated liquidation is evidenced by slaughter data. 2023 saw the second highest average weekly cow and heifer slaughter on record, just barely below the record set in 2022. In other words, for 2 years running, female cattle have been leaving ranches at historically high rates. So why have ranchers been liquidating herds at such a rapid clip? Simply put, harsh economic and environmental realities forced their hand. Prolonged drought and high input costs like feed and forage left many producers with little choice but to cull deeper than normal. By selling off breeding stock that would normally be kept, ranchers could reduce immediate expenses and take advantage of high beef prices, even though it meant shrinking their herds. The decision to liquidate is never taken lightly. These are the mother cows and future producers being sold. But when there isn't enough grass, hay, or affordable feed, culling becomes a matter of survival for the ranch. Next, we'll break down the key drivers that have pushed so many ranchers toward herd liquidation.
If there's one factor that stands above all others in this story, it's drought. Widespread and severe drought over consecutive years has slashed forage production and water availability across major cattle regions. Texas, in particular, endured back-to-back years of extreme drought that decimated pastures and hayfields. Ranchers across the state have watched stock tanks dry up and grass wither, leaving no pasture to graze. In 2021, 2022, and again in parts of 2023, many Texas counties received only a fraction of normal rainfall. The result? By early 2024, the Texas beef cattle herd continued to shrink, hitting lows not seen in a decade. Dr. David Anderson of Texas A&M AgriLife Extension noted that beef cattle numbers in Texas fell to 4.1 million head as of Jan 2024, a sharp decline linked directly to drought and consecutive years of below-average grazing and hay production. Essentially, Mother Nature turned off the tap, and Texas ranchers had to respond by reducing herd size to match the dwindling feed supply. This pattern isn't limited to Texas. Across the Great Plains and West, bouts of drought in key cow-calf states led to nationwide herd declines. Pastures that normally sustain cattle were brown and barren, forcing producers to liquidate cows they could no longer feed. From the southern plains through the Midwest, 2022 was especially brutal. By some accounts, more than 2/3 of U.S. cattle were in regions affected by drought at its peak, driving a massive sell-off of herds. Even in more temperate regions, the knock-on effects of a national hay shortage were felt. More on that shortly. For Texas, the drought of 2022 was reminiscent of the catastrophic 2011 drought, but this time it came on the heels of another dry year, compounding the pressure. Between 2019 and 2023, Texas beef cow numbers dropped about 12%, erasing gains made after the last big drought. Such a decline in Texas alone sends ripples through the national inventory, given Texas's outsized share of the U.S. herd. In short, drought has been the primary culprit in this herd liquidation phase. With little forage on the land, ranchers faced a tough choice: either buy feed at great cost or sell cattle. Many had to sell, and as cow after cow went to town, the overall herd numbers sank to levels not seen since the 1950s. Drought literally changed the landscape of the cattle industry. Dry creeks and stunted grass translated into empty pastures and lighter stocking rates.
One clear indicator of accelerated herd liquidation is the spike in cow and heifer slaughter. In normal years, ranchers call a certain percentage of cows, older or open cows, and send a limited number of heifers to feedlots or slaughter while keeping the rest as replacements to calve and maintain the herd. But during this liquidation period, those norms were upended. Unprecedented numbers of female breeding stock have been sold off, as evidenced by USDA data. 2022 saw a record high volume of beef cows and heifers slaughtered, and 2023 was only a hair behind that record. Essentially, 2 consecutive years of heavy culling of females, something rarely seen in modern times, gutted the nation's breeding herd. Why were so many cows and heifers sent to market? The drivers circle back to the drought and cost issues. For example, many producers started feeding hay as early as mid-summer in Texas, just to keep cows in condition, since pastures had dried up. By mid-July of 2023, instead of grazing on green grass, cows were on stored feed. This put ranchers in a bind. Feeding hay for extended periods is expensive and depletes winter stores. Dr. Anderson observed that having to feed hay so long led to deeper culling of herds in Texas. Producers culled not just the old and open cows, but also younger cows they would normally keep, simply because they could not afford to feed them all through the drought. Heifers, too, that would normally be kept as replacement breeders were instead sold off. High market prices for feeder heifers provided an incentive to sell, and many ranchers needed the cash flow or needed to reduce stocking rates. According to the American Farm Bureau analysis, an unusually high number of heifers were placed in feedlots in the last couple of years, rather than being retained on the ranch for breeding. This borrow-from-the-future approach boosted short-term beef supply, but at the cost of shrinking the future cow herd. It's a classic reaction to tough times: liquidate assets, in this case breeding animals, to survive the present. The consequence is that when conditions finally improve, there are far fewer mama cows left on the ranch to produce the next calf crop. The slaughter numbers tell the story starkly. For 2 years running, weekly cow-heifer slaughter rates hit record or near-record levels. Compare that to a typical year in a herd expansion phase, where female slaughter would be much lower as producers hold back heifers and keep as many cows as possible. This extraordinary offtake of breeding stock is a big reason the national cattle inventory plummeted so steeply. In Texas and the southern plains, sale barns saw long lines of trailers as ranchers sold cow-calf pairs, bred cows, and heifer calves en masse in the worst of the drought. The liquidation, while painful for many producers, helped balance their checkbooks in the short term, but it set the stage for the tight cattle supply we see now.
Hand in hand with drought comes the challenge of feed costs and availability. When the rain stops and the grass dies, you either supplement or sell. Over the last few years, feed and forage became both scarce and astonishingly expensive, which greatly influenced herd liquidation decisions. The hay situation in particular reached crisis levels. By late 2022 and early 2023, U.S. hay inventories hit their lowest point in roughly 50 years. The USDA reported that hay stocks were at half-century lows, a direct result of widespread drought cutting hay production, and hay prices jumped to record or near-record highs. Texas exemplified this problem. The 2022 hay season was dismal, with some AgriLife experts calling the outlook bleak due to drought-stunted growth and sky-high fertilizer prices. Many Texas hay meadows yielded only one cutting, or none, where they'd normally get 3, and 2022 state average hay yields collapsed to about 1.5 tons per acre, well below normal. This left Texas entering winter with hay supplies near historic lows. In fact, hay stocks at the end of 2022 were among the lowest ever recorded for the state. For ranchers, this meant facing winter with too many mouths and not enough feed. Some had to ship in hay from out of state, paying steep transport costs. Others scoured classifieds and Facebook groups for any available bales, often paying $100 to $140 per round bale or more for grass hay that used to cost a fraction of that. Corn and other feed grains also spiked in price around 2021-2022, partly due to global market factors, making grain-based supplements pricey as well. The cost squeeze was intense. Even though there were fewer cows to feed after initial culling, the expense of keeping the remaining herd fed through poor grazing conditions forced tough decisions. As Dr. Anderson put it, after back-to-back poor forage years, the cost of maintaining cows through winter translated into tough decisions for some producers, namely whether to keep those cows or send them to market. Every rancher can relate to the math here. If you don't have your own hay, you must buy it, and $120+ per bale hay quickly eats up any profit from calf sales. A cow can consume roughly 25 to 30 pounds of hay per day. Over a winter, that's about 3 to 4+ tons of hay per cow. Multiply that by triple-digit hay prices, and it's obvious why many ranchers liquidated part of their herd to balance feed supply with herd size. In many cases, selling cows was the only viable way to ensure the remaining cattle could be adequately fed. Feedlots and backgrounders faced similar issues with high corn and ration costs, but the cow-calf producer on the range really felt it in the hay barn. The forage shortage extended beyond hay to pastures and rangeland. Drought not only reduces grass growth in real time, it can also damage root systems and thin pasture stands for subsequent seasons. By the fall of 2022, much of Texas and the plains had very poor pasture conditions, and even going into spring 2023, many pastures hadn't fully recovered. Ranchers who hoped for a green up found themselves continuing to feed hay later into spring, further depleting stocks. Some tried planting winter annuals or supplemental forages, but if you didn't get rain at the right time, those efforts yielded little. As one Texas forage specialist noted, recovering from such a drought requires time and timely moisture. Hay meadows have to recover from the drought of 2022, and good fertilizer and rain are needed to restore normal production. Until that recovery happened, feed remained a limiting factor. In summary, the high cost and low availability of feed was a major operational driver in herd reduction. The equation was simple: no feed, no cattle. Ranchers either paid exorbitant prices to feed their herds or sold down to numbers they could sustain. Most did some of both, culling deeper than usual to match the harsh reality of scarce forage. This painful adjustment was necessary, but it underpins why the herd is now historically small. While drought and feed dominate the conversation, labor shortages have been an important undercurrent, making ranching more challenging. Cattle ranching is labor-intensive work, fixing fences, hauling water, putting out feed, doctoring sick animals, calving out cows, and it's getting harder to find and keep skilled labor for these tasks. Many ranchers are family operations relying on their own labor and perhaps a handful of hired hands or seasonal workers. In recent years, however, the agricultural workforce has been shrinking, and ranching is no exception. A big factor is the aging of the ranching population. The average U.S. farmer or rancher is now about 58 years old, and there are roughly 4 times as many producers over 65 as under 35. This means a large share of ranch owners are nearing retirement age, and there aren't enough younger folks entering the business to replace them. For a rancher on the fence about downsizing or exiting, the events of the past few years may have tipped the balance. We've heard stories of older ranchers deciding, "One more drought and I'm done." When cow prices hit record highs in 2023-2024, quite a few took the opportunity to sell out or substantially reduce their herds, effectively hanging up their hats after decades in the business.
Some had no family successors willing to take over, and with land values strong and developers or neighboring farms ready to buy land, the incentive to liquidate the herd and sell the ranch grew. As one industry observer noted, many older producers lack succession plans and even face pressure to sell land for development, which further limits the cattle inventory. When a ranch is sold or repurposed, those cattle aren't coming back. Even ranchers who remain in business are often operating with leaner crews. The tight labor market in agriculture means it's difficult to find reliable ranch hands, especially for the wages many smaller operations can afford. The work is hard and often remote, which narrows the pool of willing workers. Without adequate help, a rancher may not be able to manage the same number of cattle as before. In some cases, couples or families running a ranch realized they had to cut back herd size to match the labor they personally could provide, since hired help was scarce. Moreover, the challenges of the last few years, long hours hauling water during drought, constant feeding, have been exhausting, and burnout is a concern. All of this counts as structural constraints on the operations side that make it harder to maintain or rebuild large herds. Labor shortages also extend to the broader supply chain, like meatpacking plants, but we'll stay focused on the ranch level. The key point is that the workforce crunch has compounded other issues, making it harder to weather tough times. When margins were slim due to high feed costs and drought, having to pay higher wages or being short-staffed added pressure on ranch finances. It's not that labor issues alone caused the herd to shrink. Drought and economics did that. But workforce constraints have certainly made ranchers more cautious about expansion. As we look to rebuilding, this shortage of labor and the aging operator population will act as a governor on how fast the herd can grow again. In other words, even if conditions improve, you still need people to care for the additional cattle, and that's a challenge the industry is still grappling with.
With the cattle herd now at rock-bottom levels, one might expect a rapid rebound once rains return and prices rise. But experienced ranchers know that rebuilding a herd is a slow, deliberate process, more like turning a huge ship than flipping a switch. There are several reasons the herd can't expand overnight, even if the intention and market signals are there. Cattle biology and heifer retention. The biology of the cow-calf cycle is the fundamental limiting factor. If you want to grow your herd, you must hold back heifer calves and raise them as herd replacements instead of selling them. Those heifers typically need to reach breeding age, usually 15 months or older, before they can be bred, and then it's another 9 months of gestation. In practice, it takes 2 years before a retained heifer can have a calf of her own, as analysts point out. This means even if ranchers started keeping extra heifers today, it would be 2027 before those heifers produce their first calves, and only in 2028 would those calves be weaned and potentially entering the herd or market. In other words, the pipeline from heifer to productive cow is long. There's just no way around the time it takes for an animal to grow, breed, and calve. Now, looking at current data, heifer retention so far has been minimal. The January 2024 inventory showed beef replacement heifers actually down about 1% from the previous year, a modest decline, but a decline nonetheless. This followed a sharp drop the year before. Only in 2024 did that free fall slow, possibly indicating the contraction phase is bottoming out. But no big jump in replacements means herd expansion hadn't truly begun yet. Indeed, as of late 2025, industry experts saw little evidence that beef heifer retention is occurring at a scale that implies expansion. Producers were enjoying high calf prices, and logically, many chose to sell their heifers for lucrative prices rather than keep them. With record-high cattle prices in 2023 to 2025, the opportunity cost of keeping a heifer is huge. You might be giving up $1,500 to $2,500 in immediate sale value, essentially betting that she'll pay off in the long run. That economic calculus, especially coming out of a drought when cash flow was tight, led many to continue selling heifers. Thus, the rebuild has been delayed at the starting line. Until a significant number of ranchers collectively decide to retain heifers, the national herd won't grow substantially.
Continued drought and weather uncertainty. Even as of early 2024, large areas of the southern plains and west were still grappling with drought or recovering from it. Ranchers are understandably cautious. They know that one wet season doesn't guarantee the drought is truly over. As Dr. Anderson noted, the ability to rebuild relies heavily on rain and soil moisture supporting forage production. If the rains come and pastures recover, ranchers can better afford to hold on to extra heifers and maybe even buy some cattle. But if drought conditions return or persist, expansion is virtually off the table. No one wants to repeat the cycle of retaining cattle only to liquidate them in the next drought. This rainfall gate is particularly relevant in Texas. There was optimism in late 2023 after some rains improved conditions and filled stock tanks, and indeed, Texas auction data showed a spike in calf prices as folks sensed the possibility of restocking. However, producers also remember how 2022 fooled some people. A decent winter and spring gave hope, then a brutal summer drought hit and dashed rebuilding plans. The lesson is clear. Herd expansion won't happen broadly until producers are confident the forage base can support more cattle for the long haul. Ongoing drought pressures and the unpredictability of weather keep many ranchers in a wait-and-see mode, prioritizing the resilience of their operation over rapid expansion. Feed market volatility and costs. Closely related, the volatility in feed and input markets makes planning a larger herd risky. Even if rainfall improves, ranchers are looking at high and fluctuating costs for things like hay, feed grain, and fertilizer. Feed costs did ease somewhat in 2023-2024 compared to the peak of the drought, but they remain above historical averages. Nobody knows if next year's hay will be abundant and cheap or scarce and expensive. This uncertainty means many will expand cautiously, if at all, to avoid overextending. As one extension economist put it, structural constraints, input costs, and financial considerations will likely delay a broad-based recovery in beef cow numbers. In plain terms, the high cost of doing business, from feed to fuel to interest rates on loans, acts as a governor on how fast ranchers can or want to scale back up. Even though cattle prices are high, which encourages expansion, the input side of the equation is also high, which discourages it. Many producers will take a slow, intentional approach to rebuilding, ensuring they can feed and finance those extra animals through whatever markets and weather bring. This cautious approach means the herd recovery, when it comes, is expected to be gradual and methodical rather than a quick rebound. Labor and operational capacity. As discussed, the labor situation and general workload capacity also influence rebuilding. An aging rancher who just went through a nightmare drought may simply not have the appetite to increase herd size again. If you barely had enough help to haul feed and break ice for 100 cows during the drought, you won't jump to 150 cows now without knowing you have the labor or equipment or technology to manage that, especially if tough conditions return. Workforce constraints effectively cap the speed of expansion. Ranchers might add a few cows here and there, but scaling up significantly could require hiring help or bringing in a younger partner, which many are not in a position to do. Furthermore, some ranchers who liquidated heavily have exited the business or repurposed their land, meaning those cows are gone for good and won't be easily replaced by the remaining operations. In Texas and elsewhere, urban encroachment and land fragmentation continue. Once a pasture is sold off for development or other uses, its capacity to support cattle is lost from the system. All these factors mean the national herd can only rebuild slowly. Industry experts predict that meaningful growth in the U.S. cow herd is unlikely until the late 2020s, perhaps 2027 at the earliest, more likely 2028 or beyond for a noticeable expansion. That timeline aligns with the biological cycle and the cautious sentiment in the industry.
In summary, the U.S. cattle herd's tumble to its smallest size since the 1950s is the culmination of several tough years for producers. Herd liquidation surged as sustained drought, especially in Texas and other big cattle states, scourged grazing lands and dried up water sources, leaving little choice but to sell off stock. Ranchers marketed cows and heifers in unprecedented numbers, leading to record-high female slaughter rates that rapidly thinned the nation's breeding herd. This was driven not only by the weather, but by the brutal math of feed costs and shortages. Hay supplies hit historic lows and prices soared, forcing tough decisions to cull deeper and avoid bankruptcy.
Add in the strain of labor shortages and an aging workforce, and many operations found it impossible to maintain previous herd sizes under such stress. The result? A national cattle inventory that by early 2024 hit levels not witnessed in over 7 decades. Looking ahead, rebuilding the herd will be a slow journey. Biological realities mean calf crops can't expand overnight. Keeping heifers today only yields more calves a couple of years down the line. Ranchers must also regain confidence in Mother Nature and the markets. Plentiful rain and forage, along with manageable feed costs, will be key to any sustained expansion. Many will rebuild cautiously, mindful of how quickly a good year can turn bad in this business. The consensus among analysts and ranchers alike is that herd expansion will be slow and intentional when it comes. Operational constraints, from pasture recovery to workforce limitations, will likely stretch the rebuilding phase over several years. For Texas ranchers, there is hope on the horizon. Recent rains and strong cattle prices have injected optimism, and some have started to hold back a few more heifers. But as Dr. Jason Clear of Texas A&M noted, even with greener pastures, the incentive to sell remains strong when calf prices are at record highs. It's a double-edged sword. High prices improve profitability now, but can slow down herd growth for the future. Every producer will have to strike their own balance. One thing is certain, the current cattle cycle has been anything but typical. After a prolonged contraction, the U.S. cattle herd stands at a crossroads. Rebuilding will test the patience and management skills of ranchers, but it will eventually happen, in due time and likely in measured steps. In the meantime, tight cattle supplies are expected to keep prices strong, offering opportunities for those still in the game. Seasoned ranchers know to plan for both good and bad times, and this situation is no different. By understanding why the herd got so small, drought, liquidation, costs, and all, producers can make informed decisions as they navigate the next few years. Here's hoping for favorable weather, abundant grass, and a chance to rebuild when the timing is right. The resilience of ranching communities in Texas and across the nation suggests that although rebuilding the herd will be a slow road, the industry will adapt and persevere, just as it always has through the ups and downs of the cattle cycle.